How many children have to die senselessly at the hands of a gun before U.S. politicians actually wake up and address the uniquely American problem of gun violence? Ask yourself this question: are we really prepared to settle for the death of children being the cost of freedom and political power? We're not even 200 days into the year, and there have already been over 212 mass shootings in America, 27 of which have come at schools. And according to the Giffords Law Center, to prevent gun violence, approximately 38 to 44,000 Americans die of gun violence every year. So what's it going to take to protect both kids, the Second Amendment, and to bring some common sense to the gun debate? One woman with some concrete answers is Robyn Thomas. Thomas serves as the executive director of the Giffords Law Center to prevent gun violence, and she took some time out of her schedule to join me this week to address the gun violence epidemic in America and how we can curb this troubling trend. I'm Kevin McShann. Let's have this conversation. But Robyn, if you're ready, I'll take a moment to welcome you to the program, and I'm very excited to talk to you about the consequential issue of gun violence and how we sort of curb the troubling trend. Good to see you this morning, and thanks so very much for being here.
My pleasure. Thanks for reaching out and inviting me to come on. It's really nice to talk to different audiences, and I really enjoy these longer format conversations because it can get a little deeper. I do, a fair amount of like news shows and stuff, and it's short. It's just, 3 or 4 minutes. So it's hard to really go deeply into the content, which hopefully we can have a little more time for today.
Yeah, absolutely. And Robyn, I was just sharing with you before we hopped onto the call that this is a uniquely American problem. There's been, I think, 212 mass shootings, and we're not even 200 days into the year. So I'm curious to first ask you about commenting on how this is a uniquely American problem and, the inaction of the U.S. Senate to do something about gun violence.
So, I think we have a couple of things at play that sort of influence where we are right now. One is that we do have an absolutely astounding number of guns in private hands in this country. We think, we don't have like exact numbers because it's not registered or anything, but we have about 400 million guns in private hands in the United States. And that is just makes it very easy for guns to fall into the hands of people who are in a time of crisis and present a risk to themselves or others, or to get in the hands of those intent on doing harm. So, we have just too many guns, and there's no requirement that they be, stored safely or kept carefully to be sort of, regulated internally, at least in a way that enhances safety. The second problem we have is we have an industry, and this isn't the only industry that this is the case for, the oil and gas industry, and there's others that fall into this category, but certainly when it comes to the gun manufacturers, they've really done I have to sort of grudgingly acknowledge a good job of capturing our government. They leverage the NRA as this organization that purports to represent gun owners, but actually the NRA represents the gun industry. And they're very aggressive lobbyists, and they've been putting a lot of money and a lot of effort into lobbying in Washington, D.C. for a long time. And really, a lot of these Republican senators are in their pocket. They sit in the pocket of the manufacturers and the NRA, and they do their bidding. And unless and until, voters in their states decide that that's not something they're willing to put up with, they're going to keep doing it because they just don't have enough incentive on the other side. And I think they leverage it to activate a very small base. There certainly are single issue voters on this, topic that in some, red states and some Republican states, they can really activate by threatening their gun rights, threatening their safety. The language is so interesting when you open up an NRA publication and see how they talk to their base. It's very much, the sky is falling and you have to rely on yourself, and the only way you're going to be safe is to buy more guns. And so they really play on people's fear and paranoia and use it to sell guns and line their pockets. And this is the problem in this country. We have this lobby, we have this industry that doesn't care about the lives and safety of Americans, and they manipulate people's fear to push the sales of more guns. And there isn't enough that we're doing to counter that narrative.
Yeah, absolutely. And, to that point, there's been, I think, 27 school shootings in America, and we're not even done half the year. And, I'm just going to be very blunt with you, Robyn, and ask you how many kids have to die before the GOP actually does something about gun violence.
When the shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary School happened in 2012, I thought that was going to be the tipping point. I've been in this job for 16 years. So, I was already sitting in the seat 10 years ago when that happened. And I thought, well, this is it. 20 school children, first graders killed in their classroom. There's no way that the parents in this country, that the moms, that the public is going to accept that this is what we have to live with, and they're going to force our elected officials to take action. And that didn't happen. Now, people get really despondent when they hear about that, but I always want to emphasize that even though we didn't get federal change at that time, we did get change at the state level. So since the shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary School, we've seen more than 450 laws passed at the state level. Many states have passed, dozens of new laws. Gun violence continues to go down in a number of states. So we didn't see progress at the federal level, but we did see a lot of progress in other places after Sandy Hook. We also now have politicians in this country. We have our sort of Republican, senators who do nothing. But on the other hand, we're seeing a lot of candidates who are now running on a gun safety platform, and they're winning. And that's relatively new. That's not something you saw happening before Sandy Hook. So dozens and dozens and dozens of candidates at both the federal and state and local level, including in their platforms, a commitment to gun safety, and they're winning. And I think, that political calculation of how this issue plays out is really important, because that's how you sort of push for change legislatively, is to make sure that, they care about keeping their elected seats. So if they think that they're not going to get away with it, with not addressing this issue, with not implementing change, then, and they're going to be, pushed out of their seats, they're going to, lose the next election, then that motivates them. So that has changed. Now, it hasn't changed quite enough at the Senate level to get what we want, but it is changing in a lot of ways, that tell me we're moving in the right direction.
Yeah, incremental progress is terrific, but I'm sure you would agree with me. For any of these parents who have to bury their kids, thoughts and prayers ring hollow. When you're faced with the grim reality of burying your kid, and You just have to turn on the news and you hear the talking points from Republicans about how this is mental health and how we have to arm teachers and do more to arm law enforcement to prevent this. But when you really look at the issue, there were armed guards both at the mass shooting in Buffalo and the one in Uvalde the other day. So I'm just wondering if you can tell me how flawed you think the argument is from the GOP when they bring up those familiar talking points.
Well, back to sort of your original comment about thoughts and prayers, it's not just rings hollow, it's infuriating. For those parents, for myself, I have children in school, worried about their safety, doing lockdown drills. Thoughts and prayers is an insult. It's disgusting that they're elected to lead this country and to protect at a minimum the safety of our children in schools. And all they have to offer in the face of massacres in our schools is thoughts and prayers. I mean, to me, it's gone beyond ridiculous, and it's appalling and infuriating. Some of their other talking points, you often hear this comment about the only thing that's going to stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. I hear that all the time from the NRA, from the Republicans, that the solution is to arm more people, to arm teachers, to have armed guards. And that is one of the biggest fallacies of all. I mean, here at Uvalde, you saw, or you're hearing now in the reports, 19 police officers armed and trained outside the school, supposedly the good guys who were supposed to stop the bad guy, and they did nothing because they were faced with a very dangerous situation, someone with an AR-15 rifle, and they would have been endangering their own safety. And instead of that good guy jumping in and saving the day, they didn't do anything because the whole myth is ridiculous. And when you have more guns, when you have more armed civilians, people who aren't even trained to use them properly, you end up with more gun violence. And altercations are more likely to escalate and lead to someone getting hurt. Guns are, taken by people who are in a time of crisis and used to harm themselves. 80% of school shootings are kids who get unsecured guns out of the home and take them to school. So this myth that they're selling that, more guns is what's going to make us safer, that arming more civilians, more teachers is how we're going to prevent this. Actually, when you arm teachers, you increase the risk of kids in school being exposed to gun violence. When you have a gun in the home, you dramatically increase your family's risk of being subjected to gun violence. So it's the opposite. They're peddling this story that's the opposite of what is true, and Americans are sort of falling for it. And this is, it's one of the many reasons we're in the situation that we're in.
Yeah, and forgive me for being pessimistic, Robyn, but I know that the Senate is trying to cobble together a bill to, when they come back from their most recent recess, to address this. But when you look at Senator Chris Murphy, who's leading the effort, and they're talking about things like red flag laws, increasing funding for mental health, but they're really not addressing the issue. So tell me, how optimistic are you that something will actually get done after this Senate recess? And do you think they're missing the mark by not addressing the gun issue itself?
Well, Kevin, I'm an eternal optimist. You can't work on this issue without being an optimist. It would be too much to bear. So I'm always hopeful that maybe this is the tipping point. I haven't seen exactly what this compromise bill is that they're working on. I will tell you that if they compromise too much, it won't be worth its weight. So, at the point that they want to pass a background check bill that has too many loopholes in it, like the original Brady background check bill of 1993, or they, just fund mental health, but don't also fund gun regulation, it might sort of assuage people into thinking they're doing something, but it's not going to have enough impact. In order for legislation to actually begin to move the needle on gun violence in this country, it has to be sturdy law. So, a background check bill, which should be the first step in all of this, needs to be, comprehensive enough to actually work. It has to apply to all gun sales. There needs to be a minimum number of gaps and loopholes in it if it's going to be effective at keeping guns out of the hands of people who are likely to do harm with them. So, background checks, risk protective orders are an excellent tool, particularly for preventing suicide and mass shootings. I think they're useful to a degree, and I think they're a really important tool for law enforcement. I would love to see more states passing, they call them ERPO laws, extreme risk protective order, or red flag laws. I think that would be a step in the right direction. I think raising the minimum age to purchase, especially things like AR-15s, from 18 to 21 would be a really good step. Safe storage laws, which require people to store guns safely when they're not being used, would go a long way to preventing accidents, suicides, mass shootings like many of the ones that we see, or at least shootings amongst young people. Gun violence and gun death is now the #1 cause of death for children in America, age 1 to 18. So, there's a lot we can do, at least to prevent that type of shooting. Gun violence, one of the things that's difficult about this conversation is that you're really talking about really 3 different kinds of gun violence. They do overlap a bit, but you have, accidents, you have suicides, and you have homicides. And each of those have different aspects to them. So, suicide and the types of policies that we need to implement to prevent suicide is different from the types of policies that we want to consider in preventing homicide or accidents. They do overlap. Things like risk protective orders and safe storage cross over into multiple areas. But, we have to be willing. Part of what's so frustrating to me as a policy expert is to solve this problem, it's going to take a little bit of nuance. We're going to have to be willing to talk about the different policies that are available, how they work, what they do, something like risk protective orders, red flag laws are only effective if we also first have universal background checks, because one of the things those laws do is prevent someone who's in a time of crisis from buying guns. Well, if you don't have universal background checks, you can just go to a private seller or online or a gun show and buy guns there, even if you have a protective order against you. So, we need to talk about and understand how these things fit together in a way that's effective. And you very rarely hear anyone having that deeper level conversation.
Yeah, it's all interconnected, isn't it?
It really is.
I know that your center says that approximately 38,000 people die of gun violence every year, and as you know, that it's particularly targeted in Black and other communities of color. So tell me, how do you think is the first step that the average citizen can get invested in the problem, and what do you think it's more targeted in Black or other communities of color?
So the number is actually up over the last 3 or 4 years. It was about 32,000 people killed, but actually last year I think it was about 44,000. So the number has gone up quite dramatically over the last 3 or 4 years, very sadly. And when you talk about that 44,000, about 2/3 of those people are dying because of suicide. So, that's an issue we can talk about separately. But putting that aside, when you look at homicide and the number is something like 10 or 12 or 14,000 people who die from gun homicide every year, about half of those deaths are happening in Black and brown communities and communities of color, particularly impacted communities where there's less resources. And a lot of that has to do with not having access to opportunities. And a lot of the gun violence in those communities is being driven by a very, very small number of individuals. I think one of the fallacies about gun violence in certain communities is that these are just violent communities, and that's absolutely not true. In fact, most of the gun violence, say in a city like Oakland, which has had a lot of success with reducing it, is driven by about 0.5% of the population. So city like Oakland, under 500,000 residents, the gun violence there is being driven by 200 or 300 people who are most at risk of shooting someone or being shot. And that's where you really have the core problem. And they have found that when you have targeted interventions, when you bring together community leaders, law enforcement, outreach workers, you get everyone on the same page about intervening with that very, very small number of individuals, and bring resources to the equation. That's the key. You need to bring adequate resources to those intervention strategies. You can reduce gun violence dramatically. Oakland was able to reduce gun violence by almost 50% in the 7 years that when it started in around 2012, and when it was measured in 2020, it was about a 50% reduction because of those strategies. Now it's gone up, unfortunately, quite a lot because of COVID, but we're hoping it will be reduced again once those programs can kind of be at full force. So, that part of the problem, and it is about lack of opportunity, lack of resources, and a flood of guns into those communities. And there's underlying issues about access to services, which, create some trauma. There is violence over generations, which creates trauma, which sort of propagates the problem. But this is a problem that can be solved, and it actually can be solved with far less resources than people think. The number I've heard is for every dollar invested in these programs, a city can save $7 in costs of, when you reduce shootings by X amount, you reduce law enforcement costs, hospitalization costs, court costs. You really ultimately investing in reducing the problem saves communities money, not to mention just the absolute sort of humanitarian impact, which I think is very, very important. So, that to me is a really important story that isn't being told enough, and that I try to speak about as much as possible, because these community violence interventions are effective and powerful, and they're community driven and community based, and they are transforming the neighborhoods where they're most effective.
Yeah, it all starts at the local level, doesn't it?
Always. Person to person is where we start.
Yeah, absolutely. And, Robyn, I also wanted to ask you about the assault weapons ban. When it was allowed to expire, gun violence obviously was increased. And I'm wondering if you have any hope that we may get back to a place where sensible politicians may look at instituting a similar ban on assault weapons, because 18-year-olds shouldn't have access. Now, this is just my personal opinion, but 18-year-olds shouldn't have access to AR-15. I mean, you look at what happened in Uvalde, and the shooter, and he bought them on his birthday. And I'm just curious to know your thoughts on whether we can get to a place where our politics are so not territorial, where we don't vote on this sort of issues down party lines.
So, the first part of your question, which is, whether we should or can or will, institute some sort of regulation or restriction or ban on assault weapons. I mean, I can't believe we're not having a more robust conversation about that. And I hope that we will be in the coming weeks and months. These are guns that are not used for sport shooting. They're not used for hunting. They're not used for self-defense. These are guns people like to collect because they're fun, or because they make them feel powerful, or because they find them an interesting machine, none of which to me are adequate reasons to have such weapons of war and death in the hands of untrained civilians. And certainly they're the kinds of guns that should not be available to people under 21. We know this, but your brain isn't even fully developed and matured until you're 25. So you can't drink alcohol until you're 21, and yet we're allowing an 18-year-old to buy and own a weapon that can cause the kind of destruction that we're seeing. It's astounding to me. Handguns are more regulated than AR-15s. You have to be 21 to buy a handgun in most places. So This to me is an area where the absolute first thing we should be doing is raising the minimum age to buy assault weapons to 21. And then these are the types of guns that need to be properly registered. You need to have training. You should be forced to have a background check, no matter whether your state requires background checks on all gun sales. These are guns the federal government should require to have background checks on. So, there definitely needs to be at minimum better regulation of these guns. And I would say if I had my way, I would restrict them seriously, because I don't think that there's any really valid argument for why it needs to be available to everyone. Maybe it's something we could restrict in a way that makes our communities a lot safer.
Yeah, and you look at the role that President Biden has in this discussion, and I think he said that he was hopeful that the Senate would come up with a compromise. But do you think he should be more vocal on this issue? And do you think he's done all he can using his political sort of will and power to make a dent in this issue?
One of the hard things, and that's different about the United States than Canada, is that the president, without the support of both houses, has limits on what he can do. He can do certain things under his executive authority, but he can't necessarily push laws through. And on top of that, we have this filibuster rule, which requires more or less 60 votes in the Senate to get most things done. So, he is in a difficult situation where just because he wants a legislation to go through doesn't mean he has the capacity to push it through. He has done quite a few things in his executive capacity, including, trying to regulate ghost guns and, sort of a whole slew of other approaches to supporting better regulation, but it's limited. Now, he could be saying more. He certainly does speak up against this issue. I don't know enough about, the ins and outs of Washington, D.C. to know how hard he's pushing to try and get things done. I hope in the coming weeks we'll see him pushing harder, kind of calling the Republican senators who are unwilling to even vote on these measures to the mat for their inaction. Obama tried, and I know Biden's been trying, but, I think he can do more and he should do more, but it is people outside of the US, our system, it's not, because it's not a parliamentary system, it's a lot more limited. The president doesn't have the same capacity to move things the way they do in other countries.
Yeah, and we were talking before we started recording it about the steps that Canada has taken to sort of curb this issue. So what is that the U.S. government can learn about what we're doing about gun violence on this side of the border?
I think what you have in Canada is a lot more willingness to, and Canadians, I think, do own quite a lot of guns. They do, hunting is a big thing in Canada. People respect and appreciate owning guns, but there's just so much more robust regulation around purchases, around storage, around what types of guns you can own. And now there's going to be even more. Justin Trudeau's been talking about, basically stopping new manufacture and transfer of handguns in Canada and assault weapons. And so, I think the rest of the world, when a tragedy happens, looks at the nature of the problem and takes steps to fix it. And this issue, Australia took a lot of steps to regulate guns after the shooting at Port Arthur. New Zealand took really dramatic steps after the shooting there a few years ago. Scotland as well. You have lots of countries now, Canada, who own a lot of guns in private hands. Switzerland, Israel, there's lots of countries around the world that have a lot of guns in private hands, and they do not have the gun violence problem that the United States does, because they regulate guns, because individuals, citizens understand that gun ownership isn't some, absolute unfettered right. It's something that is a privilege, and they need to respect, safety, and they need to respect the rights of others to live safely, to own these guns. And I think that's why you see a different attitude and a different outcome. And the US would be well served to be studying those systems and, taking greater steps.
Yeah. And we talked earlier about the Second Amendment not being absolute. And I'm sure that you are on in the camp of not wanting to infringe on law-abiding citizens owning guns if they choose to do that, but there has to be a middle ground. And in fact, most people who own guns want this to be done safely and effectively. So there has to be a middle ground where we protect Second Amendment rights and also address the issue of gun violence. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that there's a way to protect private gun ownership rights and regulate guns in a way that would dramatically reduce gun violence. We track about 50 different policies when it comes to gun regulation. And there are some states like California and New York and some others where there's very comprehensive and robust regulation in place and much, much lower rates of gun violence in those states than states where there's no regulation. So, we know what those steps are. We could talk about, sales and purchases and types of guns and the way that people are responsible for their guns. I often suggest people look at the way we addressed car safety and car deaths. Back in the 50s and 60s, lots and lots of people were dying from car accidents. And there was a very comprehensive approach taken to reducing that on the public health model. So everything from making cars safer, airbags and steering columns and crumple zones and all the things that make the car safer. Then they changed behaviors. They made drunk driving. They put more penalties on it. They made it less socially acceptable. They changed the way roads work and speed limits and bank curves and all the things we did to try and reduce the injuries from cars. Now, we have more cars than ever on the roads in this country, but we've managed to reduce car death by 80% over the last 50 years. So, that comprehensive approach, which looks at all the ways you can still have guns in our society, but have far less negative impact from them, which includes things like better mental health treatment in this country. It is not going to work alone without also regulating guns better, but we should, of course, be doing that also. Mental health support in this country and all countries is absolutely crucial to a healthy, functioning society, and we should be doing a lot better, but that's not the solution alone to reducing gun violence. So, really a comprehensive public health approach is the only way we're going to, over time, see a reduction of this problem.
Yeah, and I have a couple of more questions for you. The first is, Senator Ted Cruz, he loves to speak out on camera when he wants to make a political talking point, but he doesn't actually seem interested in actually doing the job that he was elected to do. And, you just listen to him specifically, and the reason I bring him up is because his argument on this issue is so, for a lack of a better word, flawed and uneducated. So I'm just wondering, when you have politicians, specifically like him, adding their misinformed voice to the argument, I'm wondering how much more difficult does it make your job when you have politicians that are trying to sell a different narrative to the public?
It makes it very difficult if people aren't willing to find out the truth for themselves. If people are going to simply listen to misinformation, self-serving misinformation spouted by politicians, then they're just going to believe it and not dig any deeper, it does create a problem because the basis for the whole conversation is misinformed, and that's not how you fix problems. And this isn't an issue where it's a matter of my opinion or yours. There's certainly aspects of it that are opinions, but most of the conversation needs to happen in the realm of the truth and the facts, and that's not what Ted Cruz cares about. He doesn't go out there talking about research or statistics or hard facts. He spouts a bunch of nonsense about the Second Amendment or about, the good guy with the gun or whatever whatever his approach for the day is, and then walks away. He doesn't actually have a meaningful conversation. And I think people just, aren't willing to dig in and learn the facts. So they accept what he's saying as the truth or enough, and they kind of like wash their hands of it. Well, he says there's nothing we can do, so I want to believe him and I'm going to not worry about it. And I think that is part of the problem. Americans are, I think, notoriously not willing to dig in, not willing to really learn and read and understand issues so we can have solutions. And that's, you either need to elect people who are willing to do that, or you need to do it for yourself and hold them accountable. And in a lot of places in this country, neither one of those things is happening. There's almost an elevation of ignorance on some things and simplicity, which is not serving us.
Yeah, absolutely. And Robyn, my final question for you today has to do with your final message about addressing the urgency of gun violence. And if you had a message to any one of these parents that had to go through the agonizing pain of burying their kid this week, what would you tell them?
Gosh, Kevin, I have kids and I think about this all the time because of the work I do. And I honestly cannot fathom the depth of pain and sadness and devastation that these parents must be living with. I talk a lot every day about not giving up, about having hope that we can solve this problem, about the need to remain angry and active and speak out, and don't let this pass in a week or two and get distracted and not be talking about it. And I would just say to those parents that, particularly for those of us that are fighting on this issue, we are never going to give up. We are never going to stop fighting for a safer future for everyone's children, so that other parents don't have to experience the pain and trauma that they're going through right now. So I say to Americans in general who care about this issue, do not give up. Call every day. Call your senators, call your congressmen, whether they're on our side in terms of change and regulation or not. Make those calls. Be loud, be heard, don't give up. That's what they're counting on. They're counting on us moving on to the next issue. And unless we're willing to fight for this, it won't change. So, to let the parents know that we will do everything we can to fight for them, and we stand with them. And for the rest of the people out there who care about these families and care about what's happening and the safety of your own children, to be willing to stand up and fight, even though it's difficult and uncomfortable and hard, that is the only way we're going to have a safer country in the future for our children's children.
Yeah, absolutely. And finally, Robyn, tell me, if people want to get connected with the Giffords Law Center on gun violence, what's the best way they can get connected with the good work that you do?
So if you go online, www.giffords.org, there's lots of ways you can get involved. Everything from joining our mailing list, donating money, showing up to events. There's a whole lot of rallies happening and protests and press conferences and hearings next week in Washington, D.C. for folks who live nearby and maybe want to be there for it. There's more information about it on our website. You can certainly sign up to get involved over the long term. For those of you out there who are gun owners, we have a gun owners network. We're trying to make sure the voice of common sense gun owners who believe in regulation and understand that this is an issue that they want to be on the right side of. I urge you to join our gun owners network. So just to go to our website, and you'll find lots of information there, as well as ways to get involved and to stand with us.
Terrific. Robyn, well, I have to tell you, I thoroughly enjoyed diving deeper into this consequential issue of preventing gun violence. I want to thank you for the good work that you and your staff do on this issue, and for joining me this morning. It's most appreciated.
Thanks so much for having me, Kevin. It's been lovely talking to you.